You should have seen Margaret's face when I told her she was trespassing on my private lake. The color drained from her cheeks faster than water through a broken dam. Picture this. I'm standing on my dock, pointing at brand new no trespassing signs while HOA chairwoman Margaret Winters goes pale as fresh snow. Her kayak paddle freezes mid-stroke. The scent of pine and barbecue smoke drifts across the water in the August heat. 15 neighbors gather on the shore, watching Margaret realize she's been harassing the actual property owner for months. But here's the thing. This wasn't just about lake access. Margaret had been planning to slap our community with $1.8 million in special assessments using bogus shared waterfront claims. She thought she'd found easy prey when I inherited this place. She couldn't have been more wrong. What would you do if your HOA tried to grab your private property right in front of your barbecue guests? Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I guarantee your HOA has pulled something just as outrageous. Let me rewind and explain how I accidentally became the target of the most brazen property grab I've ever witnessed. My name's David Blackwood, and 8 months ago, I was living a totally different existence in Denver. Freshly divorced, exhausted from my structural engineering career, and honestly doubting every decision I'd made since graduating college. Then came the phone call that flipped everything upside down. My uncle Raymond had died, leaving me his entire waterfront property in Pine Ridge, Montana. Now, Uncle Ray wasn't your average landowner. This guy was practically the unofficial king of Clearwater Lake. He owned 963 acres, including 1.8 miles of untouched shoreline, and for 50 years, he'd been the community's beloved lake protector. Annual fish tournaments, kids swimming lessons in his cove, neighbors borrowing canoes without asking twice. Uncle Ray treated that lake like everyone's backyard. I spent countless childhood summers here, absorbing water rights lessons while dock boards groaned beneath my feet and the aroma of cedar mixed with whatever trout Cousin Mike was filleting at the cleaning station. The estate was magnificent. Main lodge, guest cottages, private marina, even the weathered remains of a 1910s logging mill that Ray always swore he'd rebuild someday. That's when I encountered Margaret Winters. And brother, this lady was something else. Picture this. 48 years old, self-proclaimed Pine Ridge Community Oversight Coordinator, a position that sounds official until you discover she invented it herself. She'd relocated from Seattle suburbs 4 years ago on a crusade to upgrade community standards, which apparently meant policing everyone's fence height and paint choices. Always dressed in crisp blazers despite never attending business meetings, driving a silver Lexus sedan with Community One vanity plates. She radiated that particular energy of someone who tasted HOA power and found it addictive. She appeared exactly 10 days after my arrival, folder in hand, wearing that predatory grin that screams, "I'm about to wreck your weekend." "We need to address your uncle's casual arrangements with the neighborhood," she declared, standing in my entryway like she belonged there. The sound of shuffling paperwork mixed with her cologne, the expensive kind that costs $150 an ounce and smells like it's masking something foul. Here's where things get interesting. Margaret produces this 52-page community waterfront management contract demanding a $15,000 annual stewardship fee. She insisted lake access had been an understood easement that required formal documentation now that ownership passed to a newcomer. The way she emphasized newcomer made it obvious she'd already labeled me the villain. "Your uncle was always reasonable about community needs," she purred. "I trust you'll want to maintain that cooperation." I politely refused, explaining I was still sorting through Ray's paperwork. Her smile could have frozen the lake in midsummer. The next weekend, I threw a cookout for 6 college buddies, my first shot at recreating those epic gatherings Ray used to host. We're having a blast until 1 p.m. when Hurricane Margaret storms onto my dock clutching laminated infraction notices. "Excuse me, this community maintains certain standards," she announced, demanding a guest roster like she was running airport security. "Your uncle respected appropriate protocols." The smell of grilling steaks couldn't cut through the awkward tension as my friends started loading their cars. Party canceled, thanks to the self-appointed Lake Patrol. That night, feeling like I'd somehow dishonored Ray's legacy, I decided to dig deeper into his office. Behind a filing cabinet, I discovered a concealed compartment because apparently my uncle was half accountant, half spy. Inside a metal lockbox were original property titles, survey maps, and water rights papers dating to the 1930s. One document made me smile like Christmas morning. Clearwater Lake Water Authority. Deed 1934, signed, sealed, recorded with the county, granting my family complete ownership of the entire lake. You know what I discovered from my engineering experience? When someone challenges your property rights, county records don't lie. Everything else is just noise and wishful thinking. Margaret had been operating a shakedown scheme on property she didn't own, couldn't manage, and possessed zero legal claim to. I realized I wasn't facing an overzealous neighbor. I was confronting a scam artist and she'd just targeted the wrong guy. Tuesday morning smacked me like a cold slap, literally. I walked to my Jeep and found an official-looking cease and desist notice tucked under my windshield wiper, corners flapping in the breeze like a white flag. Except I wasn't the one surrendering. The document appeared legitimate initially. Fancy letterhead and legal-sounding terminology claiming the Pine Ridge Homeowners Coalition possessed exclusive recreational rights to my waterfront. It threatened $750 daily penalties for unauthorized lake usage and bore the signature of something called Mountain Legal Associates. The aroma of fresh toner and desperation practically radiated from the page. But here's the deal, and this is where my engineering training proved invaluable. I spent 15 minutes analyzing that letterhead and realized it was phonier than Margaret's community authority. No real law firm operates from a UPS store mailbox, and Mountain Legal Associates sounded about as legitimate as Totally Not a Scam LLC. Margaret's power play sparked my curiosity about what story she'd been spinning for the neighbors. Time for some investigation. First stop, Mrs. Helen Rodriguez, 74 years old and sharp as a razor, who'd lived across the street since the Reagan years. Margaret showed up like a whirlwind, Helen explained over tea that could have stripped varnish. Her kitchen smelled like fresh bread and justified anger. Your uncle never charged a soul for 50 years. Then suddenly this woman appears preaching about proper oversight and community standards. Next, I visited Tom Bradley, a retired firefighter who lived 4 houses over. Tom revealed the real shocker. Margaret had been collecting $250 monthly lake access fees from 19 families for nearly 3 years. That's almost $5,000 monthly, folks, for providing absolutely nothing except printed invoices. The Garcias, a young couple who'd moved here for affordable lakefront living, were now paying $3,000 annually to Margaret for the privilege of using what they believed was shared property. Their twin boys kept asking why they had to pay to fish when old Mr. Blackwood never charged anyone. Time for a courthouse visit where I spent the afternoon with Clerk Janet, a woman who understood property records like I understood load calculations. The musty scent of archived documents mixed with the rhythmic whirring of the photocopy machine as we uncovered the truth. Discovery 1. No HOA had ever been officially registered for Pine Ridge. Zero documentation, no filing, no legal foundation whatsoever. Discovery 2. Margaret's property deed showed a standard residential parcel with absolutely zero water rights. She owned her driveway and garden, period. Discovery 3. Ray's 1957 property survey clearly documented private ownership of the entire lake, extending to the high water mark. I was feeling confident about my research when Thursday brought a knock at my door. Sheriff's Deputy Williams stood there looking uncomfortable, hat in hand. "Sir, I've received a complaint against you for intimidation and property damage," he said, checking his notepad. "Woman claims you destroyed community signage and menaced residents." I had to chuckle. "Deputy, the only thing I've damaged is Margaret's delusion about owning my lake. Want to review the actual property titles?" His expression shifted as I spread the courthouse documents across my dining table. The look on his face was priceless, like watching someone realize they'd been trying to ticket the homeowner for parking in their own driveway. "Well, I'll be," he muttered. "She never mentioned you actually owned the lake." We drove to Margaret's house together where she was trimming her roses in full business casual. That confident smirk spread across her face like butter on toast. The smirk melted faster than ice in July when Deputy Williams started explaining basic property law. "Ma'am, appears there might be some misunderstanding about ownership around here," he said tactfully. "There must be an error," Margaret stammered, her pruning shears clicking nervously. The smell of rose fertilizer and mulch couldn't hide her mounting anxiety. "The community has always maintained lake privileges." "You're absolutely correct, Mrs. Winters," I replied, keeping my tone friendly and measured. "My family has shared it generously for decades, but charging fees for property you don't control, that's not sharing, that's fraud." News spread through Pine Ridge faster than wildfire in August. 2 families stopped paying Margaret's lake fees immediately. The general store owner started discussing the property dispute with every customer. Tom Bradley offered to help me research HOA registration procedures. God bless him. But Margaret wasn't finished. Friday night delivered another final warning taped to my front door. This time alleging Ray had signed some mysterious verbal contract witnessed by community elders. She threatened to initiate legal action for violation of neighborhood agreements, which was remarkable considering no agreements existed. That's when I understood polite correction wouldn't suffice. Margaret was doubling down on insanity, and I needed to prepare for whatever came next. Wednesday morning brought a new dimension of boldness that honestly amazed me. I discovered a bright flyer in my mailbox advertising a community gathering for Friday at 6 p.m. Topic: Waterfront Privileges and Safety Protocols. The flyer identified Margaret as Pine Ridge HOA Executive Director with qualifications that would embarrass a snake oil salesman. Here's the beautiful part. 28 households received invitations, but somehow mine vanished in transit. Curious how that happens. Helen called that evening, and I could practically hear her eye rolling through the phone. "That woman's been making rounds with some ridiculous story about you planning to barricade the entire coastline," she reported. "Claims you're an outsider who doesn't respect local traditions." Tom Bradley shared even juicier intelligence. Margaret was telling recent arrivals I plan to install admission gates and prohibit children from swimming. The Morrison family actually confronted me at the post office, their 6-year-old son tugging my jacket with tears streaming. "Are you really going to stop us from swimming, Mr. David?" he asked, and it nearly shattered my heart. This was psychological warfare, and Margaret was weaponizing children. Time for some reconnaissance of my own. I visited Pine Ridge Township Hall to investigate community meeting permits. The administrator, a no-nonsense woman who'd probably witnessed every scheme imaginable, shook her head when I described Margaret's operations. "No permit registered, no legal HOA documentation, no liability coverage," she confirmed. "If she's collecting funds and conducting official meetings, someone should contact the State Fraud Division." The aroma of institutional coffee and copy machine toner filled the air as she provided copies of property records for neighboring parcels. Plot twist. 4 other families actually owned their individual shoreline sections too. Margaret had been scamming people who didn't even require her authorization to use the water. Friday evening arrived, and I decided to infiltrate Margaret's propaganda session. The community hall was crowded, 35-plus residents crammed into metal chairs, cookies and coffee on card tables, and Margaret positioned at the front with a slide presentation like she was leading a corporate merger. The overhead lights buzzed while the scent of stale coffee mixed with nervous anticipation. Margaret clicked through slides depicting overcrowded lake scenarios, which were just photos from my cookout, and warned about insurance risks and property value destruction. "Without professional oversight," she proclaimed, "we're one incident away from lawsuits that could devastate this entire neighborhood." I waited until she completed her 25-minute fear campaign before rising during the question period. "Mrs. Winters, impressive presentation," I announced loud enough for everyone to hear. "Could you clarify which legal authority granted you lake oversight rights?" You could hear a feather drop. Margaret's complexion cycled through more colors than a sunset. "Well, your uncle's verbal understandings and community customs," she stammered. That's when I retrieved my folder of courthouse records and began distributing copies to nearby residents. The rustling of papers sounded like rain on leaves as people examined the evidence. "These are the original 1934 water rights deeds," I declared. "They encompass the entire lake. 4 other families here also own their waterfront sections. None of us authorized anyone oversight privileges." The whispers started quietly and grew like approaching storm clouds. Several residents were Googling their own property deeds on smartphones, probably for the first time ever. Margaret attempted to recover, insisting my documents were obsolete and that current community standards supersede historical property rights. Then she committed her critical error, mentioning she'd already banked $6,800 in the community lake oversight account. "So you've been collecting money for services on property you don't own or manage?" I asked sweetly. That's when the floodgates opened. The Morrison family stood up first. "Wait, we've been paying for what exactly?" "Tom Bradley, Margaret, you told us this was legally mandatory." Helen's voice sliced through the chaos. Ray Blackwood never charged anybody a dime in 50 years. Margaret grabbed her laptop and beat a hasty retreat, yelling something about legal representation being contacted. The community hall exploded in confused discussions as 9 families approached me asking about reimbursements. Lisa Park, who runs the local diner, volunteered to organize a legitimate community discussion about lake access, one grounded in actual facts rather than fantasy. 2 residents mentioned Margaret had been photographing their properties for documentation purposes, which sounded about as authentic as her HOA leadership. But here's where things escalated dramatically. The following morning, I discovered surveying markers around my property with pending assessment ribbons fluttering in the wind like warning flags. A quick call to the county development office revealed someone had submitted a preliminary application about subdividing my lakefront for a community recreation complex. Margaret wasn't just stealing fees anymore. She was scheming to force the sale of my land through some kind of development racket. The woman had evolved from petty con artist to full-scale property pirate. And honestly, I was almost impressed by her nerve. Almost. Certified mail arrived Monday morning like a legal grenade wrapped in official packaging. The return address read Lakeside Development Solutions, which sounded about as credible as Margaret's HOA credentials, and contained a preliminary evaluation notice that made my morning coffee taste like motor oil. The letter claimed my lake property was under consideration for Community Enhancement Initiative and suggested I might benefit from collaborating with local stakeholders rather than opposing inevitable improvements. The return address matched that same UPS store box from Margaret's bogus legal letters because apparently she believed changing letterheads would fool someone with an engineering background. Time for another county development office visit where I learned Margaret had filed an application for community lake access enhancement, with herself designated as the official neighborhood representative. The plans were stunning in their audacity. Marina expansion, a 50-car parking facility, and seasonal rental cabins dotting my shoreline like she was designing a vacation resort. The real kicker, the application claimed overwhelming community endorsement with over 35 resident signatures attached. I recognized several names from Ray's old tournament rosters, so I started making house visits. Helen's reaction was priceless. She never asked me to sign anything about development. I signed a petition about jet ski noise because some moron nearly killed the Rodriguez's cat. Tom Bradley was equally baffled. She said it was for improved dock lighting, nothing about construction or parking facilities. The pattern crystallized. Margaret had gathered signatures for various lake safety concerns, then submitted them as approval for her development fantasy. That's fraud, folks, and the kind that attracts federal scrutiny when it involves waterways and wetlands. Meanwhile, Margaret launched her publicity offensive. The regional newspaper published an article titled "Neighborhood Seeks Resolution in Lake Access Conflict" that portrayed me as some out-of-state tyrant blocking traditional community privileges. They quoted an anonymous, lifelong resident saying some newcomers don't appreciate small-town values, and included a photo of my no trespassing signs beside children staring longingly at the water. The pressure campaign intensified, with neighbors making casual visits. Mrs. Patterson from the end of the block appeared wringing her hands. Margaret says you're planning to install barriers and charge entrance fees like some kind of amusement park. Young Billy Rodriguez, Helen's grandson, crushed my soul asking if their family could earn lake privileges by doing landscaping work. The scent of his grandmother's homemade cookies on his shirt made the conversation even more heartbreaking. But Margaret's masterpiece was telling residents that attorneys warned her I could legally prevent emergency boat access for rescue operations. She was literally claiming I might let people drown over property disputes. The woman had graduated from petty scammer to complete sociopath. Lisa Park mentioned a weird conversation where Margaret had inquired about seasonal tourism potential and whether the diner could accommodate increased summer traffic. That sparked my investigation, and I found Margaret had been researching community-operated recreational facilities online. Concealed in her car one afternoon, I spotted a notebook with revenue projections. $75 daily boat rentals, $35 swimming passes, $150 fishing permits. She wasn't just planning to steal my property, she was planning to transform Clearwater Lake into her personal ATM. Time to recruit professional assistants. I contacted lawyer Patricia Cross in Billings, a sharp attorney who specialized in property rights and HOA conflicts. Her evaluation was direct. This is fraud with possible real estate conspiracy components. Document everything, avoid direct confrontation, and let her incriminate herself further. Patricia warned that if the development application advanced, it could trigger a costly legal war, even though I'd ultimately prevail. She's gambling you'll surrender rather than fight, she explained. Classic intimidation tactics. The community was fracturing under the strain. Helen's group, longtime residents who remembered Ray's kindness, versus Margaret's supporters, convinced I was a greedy outsider. Then there were the undecided who just wanted their kids to keep swimming without drama. Margaret escalated again by filing a complaint with the township about hazardous swimming conditions at my property. She alleged inadequate lighting, unsafe dock structures, and no lifeguard supervision made the lake a public safety hazard requiring community oversight. The sound of her heels echoing across the township office floor sounded like gunfire as she demanded official action. But I was discovering something crucial about Margaret. She couldn't control herself. Every lie demanded bigger lies. Every scheme required more elaborate schemes. Tom suggested letting her keep digging her own grave while Helen's wisdom proved prophetic. Your uncle always said the truth surfaces when people get greedy enough. So I decided to lay a trap. I started mentioning to various neighbors that I was exploring compromise possibilities and might be willing to establish formal lake access arrangements under specific conditions. Word reached Margaret within hours, and I could practically see the cash registers ringing in her eyes. She thought she was breaking me down. In reality, I was just warming up, and Margaret was about to learn that some battles you really shouldn't start. That weekend, I finally decided to properly tackle Ray's locked strongbox. I'd been postponing it, partly from grief and partly because the vintage combination lock seemed impossible to solve. But sitting in his office, surrounded by the aroma of aged leather and cherry tobacco that still permeated the wood, I remembered something he used to say, "David, the most valuable secrets hide in obvious places." The combination wasn't random numbers. It was my birthday. Because naturally it was. The old guy had always been sentimental that way. Inside, beneath the property titles I'd already discovered, lay a gold mine that made my engineering mind practically sing with joy. correspondence with the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife and Parks dating from 2001 to 2022, official documents bearing state emblems, and then the bombshell that transformed everything. Clearwater Lake had been classified as a protected habitat conservation area in 2002, with my uncle serving as the designated steward. But here's the kicker. The state had been paying him $52,000 annually for habitat management for 21 years. I kept searching and found something even better. In 2018, Ray had created the Clearwater Lake Conservation Trust with me as the automatic successor upon his death. The trust held $387,000 in accumulated conservation funds, plus continuing annual payments for ecosystem maintenance. My hands were actually trembling as I read through state wildlife classifications showing the lake supported threatened freshwater species and rare native fish populations. Any construction within 300 feet of the shoreline required state environmental impact assessments. Margaret's development plans would violate multiple state environmental protection statutes with automatic fines of $25,000 per day for unauthorized development. But the most beautiful irony was buried in the trust paperwork. As the designated steward, I was actually obligated to maintain public access for educational and recreational purposes. Margaret's demands for community access were already legally mandated, but without any fees, management companies, or fake HOA nonsense. I called Patricia Cross immediately, even though it was Sunday morning. "Your uncle was genius," she said after I read her the trust provisions. "This structure makes you legally bulletproof. Margaret's development application will trigger automatic state investigation when they discover she's planning to develop protected habitat." Patricia explained that fee collection becomes wire fraud when combined with fraudulent development claims. She's not just running a neighborhood scam anymore, she's committed state crimes. The strategic advantage was incredible. Instead of merely defending my property rights, I could now provide authentic community benefits using trust funds. Accessible boat launches, native species education programs, annual conservation celebrations. Everything Margaret had promised, but better, legal, and free. "Let her continue with the development application," Patricia advised. "State agencies will investigate and uncover the fraud during environmental review. Meanwhile, you transform from selfish inheritor to conservation steward in the public perception." I spent Sunday evening reading through Ray's detailed notes about his conservation vision. He'd sketched plans for accessible fishing platforms, educational displays about local wildlife, even concepts for a summer program teaching children about habitat protection. The old man had been thinking generations ahead, creating legal safeguards that would outlast him. Monday morning, I had my strategy. I wouldn't just expose Margaret's scam. I'd replace her entire fraudulent operation with something legitimate and beneficial. Let her dig herself deeper while I built something that actually served the community she claimed to represent. The irony was perfect. Margaret thought she was stealing lakefront property for profit. In reality, she was about to trigger a state investigation of her own crimes while I used conservation funding to provide everything she'd promised, but legally and ethically. Some days I really missed that old man. But right then, sitting in his office with legal dynamite spread across his desk, I felt like he was still protecting me. Wednesday evening found me hosting what I called my strategy session around Ray's old dining table. The scent of Helen's homemade chocolate chip cookies mixed with the sunset light reflecting off the lake through the windows as I outlined my battle plan to the team. Helen, Tom Bradley, Lisa Park, and attorney Patricia Cross, who'd driven over from Billings with a briefcase full of legal firepower. "People," Patricia began, spreading documents across the table like a commander planning an offensive. "We're not just stopping a scammer here. We're about to make David the community champion while Margaret accidentally commits state crimes." The strategy was elegant in its simplicity, a three-pronged assault that would expose Margaret's fraud while positioning me as the legitimate community steward I'd inherited the responsibility to be. Prong 1 was environmental protection. Patricia filed formal notification with Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks about unauthorized development applications in protected habitat. "This automatically triggers state investigation," she explained, satisfaction evident in her voice. "When they uncover Margaret's funding sources and signature fraud, it becomes a criminal matter." While the state got involved, I announced free environmental education programs using the trust funds. The messaging was perfect, honoring Uncle's conservation legacy while ensuring proper community access. Instead of fighting community demands, I was exceeding them legally. Prong 2 was systematic fraud documentation. Tom and Helen became my volunteer investigators, interviewing neighbors about Margaret's signature collection tactics. Montana allows single-party consent recording, so they started documenting every conversation. Lisa Park maintained detailed notes about Margaret's discussions of profitable lake management ventures. Patricia subpoenaed the community oversight account bank records, which revealed a paper trail of electronic transfers that crossed state boundaries, transforming local fraud into interstate wire fraud charges. Prong 3 was delivering the community benefits Margaret had promised but could never provide. I announced a Clearwater Lake Heritage Festival for Labor Day weekend, completely free and funded by the Conservation Trust. Free canoe rides, fishing workshops for kids, environmental education booths, historical exhibits about Ray's 50 years of stewardship. The visual contrast would be devastating. Professional community programming versus Margaret's amateur power grab. I spent the following week using trust funds for infrastructure improvements that put Margaret's promises to shame. Professional dock maintenance, safety lighting that actually functioned, life preserver stations at appropriate intervals. The accessible fishing platform from Ray's sketches became reality, built to ADA standards with help from my engineering expertise. Patricia's legal team established a comprehensive documentation system. Every interaction with Margaret got recorded. Every communication went through the attorney's office to create legal precedent. 2 neighbors agreed to witness any harassment or trespassing incidents. The psychological warfare was my favorite element. I started being aggressively pleasant to Margaret in public, always waving, asking about her weekend, mentioning upcoming free community events. Gorgeous morning, isn't it, Margaret? Perfect weather for festival planning. The woman couldn't understand why I wasn't intimidated anymore. Lisa Park contacted the newspaper editor to correct their previous biased reporting. The new story angle, Inherited Conservation Trust, provides free community lake programs. We arranged photos of me with local kids at the new accessible platform, plus expert quotes from state wildlife representatives confirming the environmental protection significance. I organized a property rights and community law information workshop at the library with Patricia as featured speaker. She explained the difference between legitimate HOAs and fraud schemes, providing handouts about verifying legal registration and recognizing legitimate fees. Knowledge is power, and I was arming the community with facts. The bait was almost too simple. I casually mentioned to Margaret's remaining allies that I was considering establishing lake access agreements through proper legal channels. Word reached Margaret within hours, and I could see her believing she might still salvage her scheme through negotiation. The state response was rapid and decisive. Fish, Wildlife and Parks investigators arrived within 72 hours of Patricia's notification, sending official letters about investigation of unauthorized development in protected habitat. The development application was suspended immediately with Margaret's plans under state scrutiny. Even better, the state forwarded evidence of fee collection to the Montana Attorney General's office for wire fraud investigation. What began as petty neighborhood drama had escalated to state criminal charges. Community momentum was building beautifully. Word spread about the free festival and professional safety improvements. Even former Margaret supporters started questioning why they'd been paying fees for services that were now being provided legitimately at no charge. 12 families volunteered for festival organization, and local businesses grew excited about the tourism potential of genuine environmental programs, rather than Margaret's fraudulent development schemes. But my favorite moment came when I realized I'd learned something vital about property inheritance that most people never discover. Environmental protections often include grant funding for improvements. I contacted the state environmental agency and learned about additional programs available for habitat conservation. The trap was set. The state investigation was underway, and the community was rallying around legitimate programming. Margaret thought she was wearing me down through intimidation. She had no idea she was about to face the full authority of state environmental law. Wednesday morning hit Margaret like a freight train loaded with state paperwork. The Fish, Wildlife and Parks investigation notice arrived at the township office, and according to the administrator who called me laughing, Margaret stormed in demanding to know who sabotaged the community development project. Her voice reverberated through the building as she accused me of lying about environmental status to obstruct legitimate community improvements. The administrator's response was priceless. "Ma'am, you can't develop protected habitat without state permits. That's been law for decades." But Margaret wasn't surrendering without a fight. Thursday night, I discovered my dock safety lights had been disconnected and the life preserver station mysteriously moved to someone's shed. Friday morning brought an even bolder escalation. Fake, private property, no swimming. Signs posted around my entire shoreline, complete with forged by order of Pine Ridge Township footers. The sound of my hammer clanging against metal posts echoed across the water as I removed the illegal signage. The smell of treated lumber and fresh hardware store tags revealed these signs were expensive. Margaret was investing serious cash in her harassment campaign. That's when her media blitz erupted across social platforms. The local Facebook group became a war zone, with Margaret posting photos and rants about the out-of-state millionaire blocking lake access. She claimed the state investigation was my attempt to weaponize environmental law against the community. Her photo editing skills were almost impressive. She'd cropped images of me removing her fake signs to make it appear like I was destroying legitimate safety notices. The comment threads devolved into 150 message battles between neighbors who'd never disagreed about anything stronger than snow removal schedules. But Margaret's smear campaign turned personal fast. She started telling neighbors I planned to charge admission for lake access like an amusement park, and claimed Ray was forced to sign environmental documents by government officials. Then she attacked my divorce, spreading rumors I was fleeing legal troubles in Colorado. 2 festival volunteers withdrew after hearing her stories, and I watched the community divide deepen. Helen and Tom started recording conversations whenever Margaret approached them, building our evidence file while protecting themselves from her increasingly desperate lies. Patricia's paralegal documented every fake social media post, screenshot every defamatory comment. "She's building our harassment case for us," Patricia noted with professional satisfaction. "Desperate people make catastrophic mistakes." Friday evening brought Margaret's most audacious move yet, a personal visit to my door with what she called a compromise proposal. I'd been expecting this, so my phone was recording when she launched into her pitch. "Look, we both know you can't battle the whole community forever," she said, fidgeting with her pearl necklace. "Why not make some profit instead of enemies?" Her offer was beautifully self-incriminating. I could keep the lakefront house, but the community would oversee lake access for everyone's benefit. She offered me 25% of oversight fees in exchange for a property usage agreement. "Think about it," she continued, not realizing she was confessing to attempted bribery on recording. 41 families paying $250 monthly. That's over $120,000 annually. Your share would be $30,000 for doing absolutely nothing. I pretended to consider her offer while she incriminated herself further. "The development application is just leverage," she admitted. "Once you sign the oversight agreement, we withdraw those plans." 25 minutes of recorded confession later, Margaret left believing she'd finally discovered my price. In reality, she'd just provided me evidence of conspiracy, attempted bribery, and admission that her development plans were fraudulent from the beginning. The state investigation accelerated over the weekend. Fish, Wildlife and Parks investigators arrived for a site inspection and discovered Margaret's unauthorized signage scattered around the property. Patricia explained that forging government agency notices was a state crime, separate from the environmental violations. Monday brought Attorney General's office investigators requesting records of Margaret's community account. Wire fraud charges were escalating because her electronic fee transfers crossed state boundaries, making it state jurisdiction. The community was fragmenting under the pressure. Anonymous flyers appeared claiming I'd hired state agents to intimidate neighbors, which was both ridiculous and heartbreaking. Helen organized a Support David response with a factual timeline of events, while local businesses started choosing sides based on economic interests. The saddest part was watching children ask their parents why they couldn't swim at the lake anymore because of Margaret's fake signs. That's when I knew the gloves were completely off. Saturday morning, I discovered the new accessible fishing platform had been vandalized. Handrails twisted, decking planks loosened, chains wrapped around the boat launch to prevent access. The sheriff's deputy who filed the vandalism report shook his head in disgust. Lady's really lost her mind now. I installed security cameras around the property perimeter and they immediately proved their worth. Sunday evening footage showed Margaret herself removing one of my cameras from a tree, apparently not realizing the other cameras were recording her destroying evidence in a state investigation. Obstruction of justice is a felony, folks. Margaret had just escalated from local scammer to state criminal, and she'd done it all on camera. Monday morning delivered Margaret's nuclear option, a certified letter from the Pine Ridge Community Legal Defense Fund that was so outrageous I actually burst out laughing. She was threatening to sue me for exclusionary practices that allegedly violated civil rights and community standards. The letterhead looked like it came from a discount copy center, complete with stock photo scales of justice. But here's where it gets fascinating. She was soliciting $750 donations from neighbors for legal action against the property monopolist. That's me, apparently. The letter was signed by a community legal advocate who, according to Patricia's quick bar association search, had about as much legal standing as my neighbor's golden retriever. Meanwhile, the Attorney General's office was having a field day with Margaret's banking records. They discovered $1,200 in her main community account from 41 families, plus a secret second account labeled Lake Enhancement Reserve Fund, containing another $6,900. Wire fraud evidence was accumulating like snowfall in a Montana winter, with electronic transfers from residents in 4 different states, snowbirds paying remotely for services that didn't exist. Patricia filed a comprehensive civil suit against Margaret while the state investigation continued. "We're not just seeking damages," she explained. "This includes class action elements to recover stolen fees for every resident she defrauded." The environmental angle added serious weight. Threatening protected habitat areas brings state prosecutors running. My security cameras were working overtime and they captured something beautiful. Margaret and an unknown man surveying my property boundaries at 2 a.m. like discount cat burglars. A quick background check revealed the man was an unlicensed development consultant with a history of land fraud schemes across 2 states. The bigger picture was becoming clear. Margaret wasn't just a local scammer. She was part of an organized effort targeting vulnerable inherited properties, specifically seeking elderly property owners and their heirs who might not understand their legal rights. Margaret organized an emergency community meeting at her house Thursday evening, complete with an agenda to formally petition the township for eminent domain action. The intimidation tactics were getting desperate. She suggested families who didn't support the action might lose all lake access permanently and warned that legal costs would be shared only among committed community members. Patricia contacted the township attorney proactively, informing them about the unauthorized meetings and fake legal threats. The township's response was swift and decisive, an official notice clarifying that no HOA was registered, no eminent domain action was planned, and residents should be aware that participating in fraudulent fee collection could expose them to legal liability. The surveillance footage kept delivering evidence like birthday presents. My cameras revealed Margaret had been accessing other neighbors' properties without permission, photographing and measuring multiple shoreline lots. She wasn't just targeting my inheritance, she was casing the entire neighborhood for similar schemes. The Attorney General's office requested all surveillance footage for their broader investigation into what they now suspected was an interstate fraud operation. Margaret had evolved from small-town scammer to state fugitive without even realizing it. The regional newspaper picked up the story with devastating coverage. Local woman accused of lake access fraud. The article included photos of her fake signs, forged documents, and unauthorized development plans. Community reaction was immediate. 2 families instantly demanded refunds of their community fees, and several others started asking uncomfortable questions about where their money had actually gone. Thursday evening brought Margaret's psychological breakdown to my doorstep. She appeared obviously distressed, her usual business attire wrinkled and her perfect hair disheveled. The smell of desperation was practically emanating from her as she launched into a rambling confession. "I'd gotten over my head," she admitted, tears mixing with mascara. "I genuinely wanted to help the community, but everything spiraled out of control." Then came the blame shifting. "You're destroying neighborhood harmony. These are innocent families who trusted me." But her final threat sent chills down my spine. "Some people are really furious about this state investigation. I can't guarantee your safety if you keep pushing." That was enough. I called the sheriff's department immediately and Patricia filed for a restraining order. The next morning, the sheriff increased patrols around my property and briefed his deputies about the ongoing state investigation. They scheduled security presence for the Labor Day festival, treating Margaret's threat as credible. The beautiful irony was watching her coalition crumble in real time. Even her strongest supporters began distancing themselves as the legal exposure became clear. Families who'd paid development fees realized their money might never be recovered, and former Inner Circle members started avoiding her calls to protect themselves from legal implications. But the sweetest moment came when families started approaching me to apologize and ask about festival participation. The community was healing itself, choosing legitimate programming over Margaret's fraudulent schemes. I announced the festival would proceed as scheduled despite recent community tensions, emphasizing positive community building and environmental education. Professional event coordination, law enforcement presence, and regional media coverage were all arranged. The final bait was mentioning the festival would include a presentation about the lake's legal history and community rights. Margaret thought she was facing a simple property dispute. She had no idea she was about to be exposed in front of state agents, regional media, and 150 community members who'd finally learned the truth. Labor Day dawned spectacular. Brilliant blue skies mirrored in the lake like a painting, with the aroma of barbecuing hamburgers already floating across the water by 9 a.m. Over 150 community members and visitors flowed onto the festival grounds, children squealing with joy as they splashed in the swimming area, while parents admired the professional setup arranged with conservation trust funds. Colorful pavilions and banners danced in the breeze, volunteer booths buzzed with activity, and 2 news crews positioned themselves strategically around the main stage. The high school marching band provided soundtrack while food vendors lined the access road, generating an estimated $12,000 in local business revenue. This was what authentic community programming looked like. Historical displays showcased Ray's 50 years of conservation work, complete with wildlife photography and interactive booths where children could learn about threatened freshwater species. The new accessible fishing platform was crowded with families, and the professional liability insurance I'd purchased meant everyone could relax and enjoy themselves without concern. At 1:45 p.m., right on schedule, Margaret made her entrance. She strode across the festival grounds like a woman on a mission, clipboard gripped in one hand and 2 remaining supporters trailing behind her like lost sheep. Conversations halted mid-sentence as she marched toward my information booth, her white blazer practically radiating righteous indignation. "This unauthorized gathering needs to stop immediately," she announced loud enough for half the festival to hear. The smell of sunscreen and lake water couldn't mask the tension that suddenly electrified the air. I was prepared for her. "Mrs. Winters, so wonderful you could join our community celebration. Perfect day, isn't it?" But Margaret wasn't here for small talk. She demanded I produce event permits and insurance paperwork, then brandished a laminated credential identifying her as a community safety coordinator, apparently her newest invented title. "As elected HOA chairwoman," she declared for the crowd's benefit, "I'm terminating this unauthorized commercial operation." The murmur of bewildered voices rippled through the gathering families. Some started packing up, uncertain what was happening. That's when I executed my move. "I appreciate your concern for community safety," I said calmly, handing her a thick folder of official documents. "Here are all the permits filed with the township, comprehensive insurance coverage for all activities, and documentation from our professional safety coordinator." Margaret's face reddened as she shuffled through legitimate paperwork that destroyed her authority claims. The crowd pressed closer, sensing drama. "Could you show everyone your official credentials for regulating community events?" I asked sweetly. That's when she made her critical mistake, producing that fake HOA registration certificate with obvious forgeries and claiming authority she'd never possessed. The news cameras zoomed in on her laminated lies, while phones materialized throughout the crowd, recording everything. I walked to the sound system and requested the microphone. "Folks, Mrs. Winters has raised important questions about legal authority here. I'd like to clarify exactly who has legal standing over Clearwater Lake." The festival's large screen illuminated with projected copies of property deeds, state designations, and conservation trust documentation. 150 people fell silent as I guided them through the 1934 water rights grant, raised surveys, and current legal ownership. "The state wildlife official attending today's festival can confirm our protected habitat designation," I continued, gesturing to Agent Thompson, who nodded professionally. "Mrs. Winters, I'd like to announce that this is all private property, and you've been trespassing for months while collecting fees for services you had no authority to provide." The crowd's reaction was electric, nervous laughter mixed with gasps of realization as people understood they'd been watching a con artist in action. Margaret's desperation became increasingly unhinged as she claimed I'd corrupted state agents and forged historical documents, but her self-incrimination was beautiful to witness. "I've been protecting this community's interests for 4 years," she shouted. "I collected over $19,000 in legitimate community fees for proper lake oversight." That's when Sheriff Deputy Johnson stepped forward with perfect timing. "Ma'am, the state has a warrant for your arrest on fraud charges." The metallic click of handcuffs echoed across the suddenly quiet festival grounds as charges were read. Wire fraud, mail fraud, forgery of government documents, obstruction of state investigation. The smell of nervous perspiration mixed with lake air as Margaret's remaining supporters retreated like she'd become toxic. Regional news cameras captured every moment of the dramatic arrest during what was supposed to be a family-friendly community festival. Children continued playing in the background, oblivious to the adult drama, perfectly symbolizing community resilience. But here's what I'm most proud of. Instead of gloating, I immediately redirected attention back to the celebration. Let's focus on what brought us together today, celebrating this beautiful lake and our wonderful community. I announced the annual festival would continue indefinitely funded by the Conservation Trust, and invited even Margaret's former supporters to participate in legitimate programming going forward. The hashtag #JustJosh'n Clearwater Lake Festival started trending regionally within hours, with overwhelmingly positive coverage of community spirit triumphing over fraud. Local businesses reported their best Labor Day sales in years, and the story got picked up by fraud prevention websites nationwide. Sometimes justice isn't just about winning. It's about building something better than what came before. 2 weeks after Margaret's dramatic arrest, the dust had settled into something beautiful. She pleaded guilty to 4 felony fraud charges, agreeing to pay $52,000 in restitution to avoid a lengthy state trial. The community restitution meeting I organized at the township hall was packed. Every defrauded family received complete refunds, plus interest calculated from their first payment to Margaret's fraudulent scheme. Helen wiped away tears as she received her $3,600 back. "Your uncle would be so proud," she told me, squeezing my hand with surprising strength. "You transformed something ugly into something beautiful." The property restoration moved quickly once state agents finished processing the crime scene. Trail damage was repaired. The fishing platform was completed with railings that actually met safety standards, and the new security system meant everyone could enjoy the lake without worrying about midnight vandals. Patricia's civil lawsuit settled for an additional $85,000, with Margaret agreeing to a permanent restraining order and public apology that was published in the regional newspaper. She lost her house to pay legal fees and restitution, her husband filed for divorce, and her adult children severed contact after the social media infamy went viral. But here's what really matters. I established the legitimate Clearwater Lake Community Council with elected representatives from surrounding families. Monthly habitat protection workshops became so popular we had waiting lists. Children's nature programs taught kids about endangered species while they splashed in the same swimming holes I'd used 30 years earlier. The annual festival became a regional attraction, generating genuine economic development for local businesses. Lisa's Diner saw a 30% revenue increase during festival weekends, and the County Tourism Board featured our conservation success story in their official brochure. Personally, I found something I'd been missing since the divorce: purpose. The township elected me to the council specifically to focus on environmental protection, and dating Lisa felt natural after months of working together on community programs. I decided to stay permanently, honoring Ray's stewardship legacy while building something new. The Conservation Trust expanded beyond my wildest dreams. Montana State University established a field research station at the lake, studying our native fish population recovery, up 35% in the first year of professional management. Invasive species were eliminated, native plants reestablished, and dead zones cleared using scientific restoration methods. Montana's Attorney General's office now uses our case to educate communities about HOA fraud prevention. The state legislature passed the Community Conservation Protection Act based on our experience, strengthening oversight of HOA formation and protecting inherited conservation properties from development pressure. Federal recognition came when Clearwater Lake became a model for community-based habitat protection nationwide. Environmental stewardship success stories featured us in a documentary that aired on National Geographic, and I've spoken at property rights conferences across 2 states. But my favorite outcome is watching the community heal itself. 25 families now participate in regular lake maintenance and conservation activities. Helen became our volunteer historian, documenting the lake's conservation legacy for future generations. The high school environmental club adopted water quality monitoring as their annual project, with students earning college scholarships through the Raymond Blackwood Environmental Scholarship I established. This year's festival attracted over 400 visitors, raising $9,500 for regional habitat protection programs. Local children call it the best lake ever during summer swimming programs, and honestly, that's worth more than any legal victory. Looking forward, the Conservation Trust has funding to acquire additional threatened habitat properties. 2 neighboring counties approached me about expanding the conservation model, and we're facing new pressure from a casino development company targeting adjacent lots. But that's a story for another time. As Ray always said, the lake doesn't belong to any one person. We're all just temporary guardians. Helen's wisdom proved prophetic. Sometimes it takes a crisis to remind people what community really means. And Lisa's perspective became my guiding principle. The best revenge against fraud is building something honest and beautiful. The sweetest irony? Margaret thought she was stealing lakefront property for profit. Instead, she triggered state protection that made the area more valuable and more protected than ever before. Her greed exposed a fraud network targeting rural communities, leading to prosecutions across 2 states. Sometimes the universe has a sense of humor about justice. Speaking of justice, drop a comment about the craziest thing your HOA has tried to pull. I bet you've got stories that would make Margaret look reasonable. And hit that subscribe button if you love seeing scammers get their comeuppance. Ring the bell for notifications when I drop the next community justice story. Remember, folks, the best defense against property fraud is knowledge. Know your rights, verify all claims, and never forget that legitimate community organizations operate transparently with proper legal registration. That's a wrap for today's episode on HOA stories. If you enjoyed watching Karma in action, smash that like button, comment your thoughts, and let us know if you've dealt with HOA madness too. Subscribe so you won't miss the next HOA meltdown we post.